And we are live. Welcome back, everyone, to the Philosophy of Art and Science podcast. As always, if you want to support the efforts of these videos, you can sign up for the newsletter, aksum.substack.com. You can support at multiple levels at patreon.com/tawado or by joining the channel directly. And obviously, you should be liking, commenting, and already subscribed to the channel. So my guest today is my brother, PhD candidate, Professor Daweet. He's on the program 7 months ago to talk to us about Juneteenth and in general African studies. Now he just recently came back from Ethiopia at a year in the Fulbright scholarship program. And we want to talk about that a little bit, but just to set it up and make this episode at least quasi standalone, they could go watch episode 7 to see some of your other ideas again. But just to keep this a little standalone, can you tell us how you got interested in Ethiopia at all in the first place, and then jump into the Fulbright scholarship and how it relates to your scholarship?
Okay, sure, no problem. So my interest in Ethiopia started as a very young child, actually, listening to Bob Marley, a lot of reggae music, which slowly led me into the Rastafari movement, which slowly led me to interest in history, the history of Ethiopia, the history of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the history of everything in Ethiopia, ethnicity, food, everything. I have just a broad interest in all of Ethiopia. I know generally, academia likes to put us in these little boxes. Oh, you're a medieval historian of Ethiopia or something like that. But in general, I'm a fan of all of Ethiopian history. I'm interested in all aspects of it. And so that, to sum up, it was basically been since I've been maybe about 12, 13 years old. I've been really interested in Ethiopia. So I made efforts to learn Fidel, to learn Amharic, learn Guraginya, learn some Tigrinya, some languages. So a lot of different languages that I'm interested in. So yeah, that sums it up, I'd say.
That's good. Yeah, it's funny. It's like a pendulum, right? At a certain point, things and people, fields were becoming more and more specialized, and people will talk about being in a what do they call them? In isolation, what do they call them? The silos,
Right.
in academia. So what you're describing is, I think, the older itself kind of Renaissance man, polymath, or simply the generalist, and people even use that phrase, jack of all trades, master of none, to try to poke fun at the generalist. But I think the pendulum is swinging in favor of the generalist more and more. So I appreciate that you look at all sides of that. So how did you get into thinking that in the middle of your PhD program, you're going to go spend a year in Ethiopia and amidst the plague all over the world too?
So, as you know, in academia, it's all about scholarships and funding and stuff like that. And so I had applied for several scholarships before to do PhD research. Basically, what to kind of sum up what my program is, I got accepted into UCLA, the history department, studying Ethiopian history, African history in the broader field of African history. And it's a 5-year program, give or take. But the 5-year program indicates the funding you'll receive. So you receive essentially 3 years of funding, and 2 years you have to teach. And then the teaching, that they pay you for the teaching or functioning as a TA or a teacher's assistant, and that accounts for 2 of your years. But anytime you can get funding in between, that basically you can defer any of those years. So I was applying for several scholarships, different grants and funding. I had applied to the Fulbright US, which is a little different from the Fulbright I received. The Fulbright US is it's not closed to only grad students. It's also open to people who are finishing their bachelor's degree or had just finished their bachelor's degree. It's open to people who are going to teach English in other foreign countries and stuff like that. And so I applied for that. I had received a spot in there as an alternate, but I ultimately did not get it. And then I applied for the Fulbright Hayes Dissertation Research Abroad Fellowship, which is a lot better. Both
would that first one have relegated you to staying in the U.S. at that time?
No. I would have gone to Ethiopia, but the difference is primarily there's two things about it. The Fulbright Hayes DDRA, which I won, is better in prestige, but it's also better financially because it provides you more money. It provides you a research stipend in addition to just money for living and stuff like that. It also, if you are a family person like I am, it provides stipends for your family too. So each one of my family members gets a stipend as well. So down to my smallest children, So the Fulbright Hayes, I had applied for that and I won that grant. And so you have like a short window of time. You can only go within the year that you won the grant. Like, right. They have the grant year is a little bit different from a direct year. It's really like a year and a half, kind of roughly, give or take. So I had this window and I said, I'm going to go in February. And it was actually originally only supposed to be 9 months. The grant was. And so we took off on February 1st of 2020. I mean, the pandemic hadn't really hit at that time. So it was kind of like no one was wearing masks on planes. There wasn't anything in the airport. There was no, I mean, people, I think they had temperature checks. That's about it. So it wasn't as serious when we left.
It was right on the cusp of it. It was not as serious in the US, but in like China, it was popping off and we were reading stuff, but we didn't know what exactly was going on.
Right, exactly. And so, I mean, there was kind of a vague awareness of it around the world and including in Ethiopia. I mean, they were aware of it. But it hadn't really kind of hit. And so, yeah, that's what motivated me to go. I didn't think anything of the pandemic. That wasn't in the back of my mind. The thing that was in the back of my mind was getting extra research done, basically having a year to research and write my dissertation. So that was the main motivations. It wasn't the middle of the pandemic. It was the border of the pandemic, if you will.
Yeah, that's right. That's good. We could say YZMA Uno. YZMA is usually, the evening before the holiday.
Exactly.
Okay, Bruno. So the subject of your study within African history, within Ethiopian history, even though it's a lot of broad stuff, I know that you're interested in Fitha Negest, which is the law or the justice of kings. What did it look like in terms of, what you were able to research while you were still in the US versus when you were in Ethiopia, in terms of like what sort of access to resources were different, and what, if anything, new did you learn? Obviously, we're not going to spill the beans of your whole dissertation here, but just to give everybody a gursha.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, when you're researching anything to do with Ethiopia or any place for that matter of fact, the actual physical place is going to be better than the US, right? So, but I mean, given the digitization of manuscripts and stuff like that, you still have access to things in the US, right? But there are certain things that you don't have access to. There's always other documents, other manuscripts that have not been digitized that are in monasteries and churches around the country. But you have also access to the brilliant minds that are the Likawent, that are the Kes, that are the different church scholars and stuff like that. And you get a chance to really build with them and talk with them about your research, and in turn kind of get some information back from them, almost a little iron sharpen irons thing. And one of the things that I've kind of that as far as my research kind of approach is so for the longest time, when you look at Ethiopian history or Ethiopian studies, people look at Ethiopian studies from the perspective of it's a written history, right? Therefore, Ethiopia stands apart from the rest of the continent of Africa, which is completely false, right?
And even internally within Ethiopia, the various groups, really you have Giz and Amharic as writing.
Right.
You don't have anything else in writing really until the 1800s. You have a few things in Harari, Gesinan, in Somali, in various scripts, but really nothing of substance until the 1800s and beyond. You have the legal code in the Tigrinya speaking areas of what is today modern day Eritrea, but really we're talking about Giz and Amharic and excluding the oral traditions of everywhere else. Even within
Amharic speakers and you know what I'm saying? There's tremendous oral traditions and oral cultures within these groups. And so for the most part, it denies that. And even amongst the church scholars, you have oral traditions and stuff like that. I can tell you in my own research, without revealing some of the data and stuff like that I've collected, I've gotten stories that you can't find in any kind of manuscripts about the use of the Fitha Negest in practice. And in its practical use in Gondor, for example, in the 17th century, and this was given to me orally from a Likawent. You know what I'm saying? So I think the oral aspect of Ethiopian history is neglected in many ways, even within the so-called kind of center of Ethiopian historiography, right? Ethiopian history has forever kind of focused on only the Orthodox Church, the center, and that's been kind of seen as the center of Ethiopian history, with everything else kind of on the periphery. But even in the center, I think to a large extent, you have a lot of oral history and a lot of oral material and memory that exist in there that could add on tremendously to what is already contained in a lot of the written manuscripts and stuff like that. Because there's a lot of history contained in hagiographies, the Gudlas. You have even in the law codes, there's history of that, history of Ethiopia, that it tells you stuff about the culture, especially since some of these books were translated into Giz and came from Syria, came from Egypt, came from different places in the world, and then they differ in Giz than they do from Syriac or from Arabic and stuff like that in different ways, and they were used in different ways too within Ethiopia. So that's kind of my approach to Ethiopian history. And so within Ethiopia, you have a tremendous amount of resources, not necessarily in the same way that you do in the U.S., but I mean there's stuff available in the U.S., but it's just not the same.
Beautiful. And we kind of got into this idea of how you're able to draw on resources there in a different way, which is great, like the oral tradition. But just to give a more basic kind of primer for the people, we've mentioned the name and the translation so far. And it's very interesting how you mentioned the source of the text itself and other texts being Egypt or Syria, other foreign countries, but then there being unique Ethiopian contributions, so that it's not just an acceptance of something, but making it your own, putting your own kind of stamp of approval on it and your own, unique watermark, let's say. So this is a book of canon laws, right? What is the purpose of it? Is it just for church practice? Is it have any effects on governance? Like, What is this book, and is it just like an artifact that we hold up? Is it like an amulet that you say this is Fitha Negest, or is it actually used by people in their lives?
This has been the argument for the longest time, that it was never really used by the people, that everyone had their own kind of local laws or traditional laws, or that were amongst different ethnic groups and stuff like that in Ethiopia. I dispute this in my research. And actually, Ethiopian Orthodox Christians will dispute it up and down too. They'll say, no, this was the law that governed Christian Ethiopia, right? And I have evidence of it in practice all over Ethiopia, from the center of where the kings were at different times. They all had different capitals, and sometimes they wandered around too. Well, not wandered, I don't like using that term, but they strategically moved their court different places, right? Everyone likes to, the wandering capitals and stuff like that. It's not aimlessly wandering around. Those were strategic locations that they picked to set up their camps, right?
Like a pop-up restaurant, or like one of those food trucks of Los Angeles.
Right. Exactly. So basically, to answer the question, the first part of the question is, it is a combination of spiritual laws, and I don't like the term secular laws, so we'll say civic laws or civil laws, right? It's divided into two portions. You have the Manfesawi, which governs the spirit, and the Sigawi, which governs the body, right? And Giz, so you have the spirit and the body. So I try and use those terms as much as possible, because what is secular law to 14th century Ethiopia, right? What's secularism to 14th century Ethiopia or 15th century Ethiopia, right? For that matter of fact, to England or anywhere else, right?
I almost thought that it's like, I wondered if it was a British-English difference, because I know Taddasa Tamrat did his PhD work out there, and he would refer to the married priests as secular. And I found it very strange when I was reading his work. I would never say that. And in fact, in Amharic, what we call them is Higgawi, right? So we call them the lawful ones because they lawfully are wedded.
Right.
I used to joke with some of the monks. I was like, does that mean you guys are not lawful, or what does it mean?
No, that's why some of these terms I don't like using, right, in my research and stuff like that. So, but if you want to be simple with it for the lay ears or whatever you want to use, it's basically laws that govern church affairs, and laws that govern civic affairs or secular affairs. There's everything in it, from building code to things governing commerce, governing business transactions, property inheritance, marriage, how kings should behave, all kinds of different things in it, hence the law of kings. But there's a lot of different codes inside the Fitha Negest that are very interesting laws, and some of them have their root in other law codes, but the way they were practiced was very, very Ethiopian, and it was according to Ethiopian tradition and according to Ethiopian methods of practicing law, or of implementing the law, right? This law code. So you had different ways of interpretation within the Mitzafbet, the traditional schools, and then in turn, the different ways of interpreting a law code would then be given or passed along to the kings or to regional rulers, and then put into effect wherever it was required or wherever it was needed. So you have several different references to the code in different Kings Chronicles and stuff like that. But you also have a lot of indirect references to the code in other places, and then other places you have just straight out direct references. For example, Mitzafa Ginzet borrows some things from Fitha Negest, and it directly says it.
That's a book for process of burying, right?
Yes, funerary practices. And this directly takes things from, this is an Ethiopian book, by the way, that it does not come from Syria or anything like that, but it is compiled based upon other books and taken, it has elements of other books in it, other holy books, as many of the compositions do. In Ethiopia, they have elements of the Synodos or Didaskalia or something else like this, right? The Kedane, different holy text or different canon texts you can find in different books that were composed for dealing with canon law. And the Fitha Negest definitely left its imprint on other texts as well.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's a wonderful introduction. So we mentioned it. You know, something funny happened where all over the world people had to kind of be distanced. Although I did see in Ethiopia, it seemed like the way in which people were practicing some of the new practices found all over the places were slightly different, maybe more lax than here in Los Angeles. And so I wonder, did you feel extra restricted in going about and attempting to find these resources? Like you said, some of them you have to go in person. And I know at least for some time they were closing the churches in person and they had the national prayer on TV. I was following some of that from a distance.
Right.
And we had our last episode while you were still in Ethiopia.
Right. So there were some difficulties going to places, definitely because of the pandemic. Also because of different political situations that were going on during the year, obviously in Tigray, and then also during the month of July when you had the internet shut down and stuff like that. When you had a lot of violence and stuff break out after the killing of Hachulu, right? So there was a lot of stuff that was kind of roadblocks on the way, if you will. And then on top of that, so maybe about a month into the research, I hadn't gotten any research done because I had to first secure a research visa. So going into the country, the U.S. Embassy had sent me you have to, get in contact with the U.S. Embassy because this is a grant from the U.S. Department of Education. So everything is through the man, if you will, right? So U.S. Embassy set up for most places in the world have a Fulbright actual office in their country. Africa, no African country has a Fulbright office. I don't know why, but not one single African country has a Fulbright office. So you have to go through basically through the U.S. Embassy, who kind of helps you with that. So the U.S. Embassy at first had granted me a 2-year research visa for everybody, my whole family. And so when we went into the airport, we presented our documentation from the U.S. Embassy to immigration, and they were like, okay, here's your month visa. We paid for it, and they only gave us a month visa, tourist visa too. So then we had to go, then we went to the office to try and get a yellow card, right? The residence card. And at first everything was good with that, but then they ended up giving one to my wife and to my kids, but did not give one to me. So,
because she's born Ethiopian and
correct.
They're considered Tulid Ethiopia, born of an Ethiopian.
Exactly. They were I qualify for it. There's no problem with that. Mm-hmm. But the U.S. Embassy wasn't really clear about all the paperwork that we needed and stuff like that. And so we were missing some paperwork, it was actually kind of funny because they had granted me the yellow card. They were like, yeah, go over there and take your picture. I was literally standing in line waiting to get the yellow card. And some random guy walks over to me. He's like, let me see your information. And he looked at it and he's like, this is completely wrong. And they took my application and ripped it up. I was like, but anyways, long story short, it was kind of a difficult time to get a research visa, but I eventually secured that. And right when I was securing it, so I hadn't done anything yet, right when I was securing it, the pandemic was breaking out in the U.S., right? And so as it was breaking out in the U.S., the U.S. Department of Education was like, Fulbright is done. You have to pack up and come home right now. Like all Fulbrighters have to go back. If you decide to stay, you're going to lose all your funding. Right? So I'd only been there a month. I had given up my housing in LA, you know what I'm saying, to go there. So I petitioned the U.S. Department of Education.
And the goal is typically 9 months, or?
No, it's 9 months to a year, anywhere from 9 months to a year. But I petitioned the U.S. Department of Education, arguing that I was safer in Ethiopia. The pandemic had not broken out on the same level. On top of that, the CDC was warning at the time not to go, they're basically warning against any international travel. They're saying, you know, airports were shutting down. Well, not airports, but, you know, flights were being canceled everywhere. And they were like, don't travel if you don't have to. And I've had asthma since I was a child, which is, you know, a pre-existing condition that they were worried about. The CDC list also as a danger for contracting COVID, right? So I argued on the stance that I was safer in Ethiopia, and it was actually putting me in danger. One, because I did not have a home to go back to in Los Angeles yet. I had just left it, whereas I had a home. I had family in Ethiopia. And I also had asthma. So I argued on that. And they eventually decided to just continue with my grant period. So
See, this is one of those, you know, classic quotes that get exchanged on the internet, that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? That was a moment where you weren't taking no for an answer. You were put in a bind. You're put in a tough spot. You know, and you said, you know what? Let me appeal. Let me try to use the actual evidence of the scenario, and it worked out in your favor. I'm so glad that happened. And in the course of your research, do you just stay in Addis Ababa or in one site, or, you know, how do you decide which sites to go to, and where all did you go?
So I have a lot of connections. On the advice of some advisors, I have some advisors who have done research in Ethiopia and who are Ethiopian as well. So I was set to go to do extensive research throughout Tigray and throughout the Amhara region, mostly in like Gondor, Gojam, and in various spots in Tigray. I was set to do research. I was able to go to Gondor and to Gojam, but I was not able to go to Tigray. Actually, I was scheduled to be in Tigray right when the war broke out. So actually, I was scheduled to be in there much earlier, but because of everything that kept on going on, first the pandemic, then the internet shut down and the bans on travel and stuff like that. And then, so finally, more towards the end of the year, like from September, everything started opening up and was, you know, kind of fine again. And so I had, after like the third or fourth time changing my plans to go to these sites, I was able to go to Gojam and Gondor for a short period of time. And then I was scheduled to go extensively for a long period of time throughout Gojam and on into Tigray. And that's right when the war broke out. And so that limited my research tremendously, but I was still able to kind of like reinvent different things that I did. Like I have a lot of connections in Gondor and Gojam and stuff like that. So during the pandemic, earlier before the war, I had conducted a lot of interviews via phone or via Skype, you know, or Zoom, excuse me. And I just kind of done things a little bit differently, you know, and also gotten some resources through contacts.
So at least you were in the same time zone. If you weren't able to meet in person, at least
Right.
being in Ethiopia made you the same time.
Right. Exactly. And so I just had to kind of reinvent my plans, the way I plan to do research, the way I did do research, and the sources I gathered. So I did some research at Addis Ababa. I did some research in Gojam and in Gondor. My research in Tigray, I did not get to do nearly a sliver of what I had planned to, but I did get a little bit done there. But obviously, my concern over there is, not my research right now. I have some friends and stuff like that I'm more concerned about over there.
That's right. That's right. This is not your first time in Ethiopia, and you had been in a conference. I actually saw you on Tigray TV before during the Mescal celebration. Talk to us a little bit about how you made it to TV there and what all you all were doing in Mekelle, because that was an interesting event.
Yeah. So in 2018. They had the 20th International Conference of Ethiopian Studies at Mekelle University, and it's the first time at Mekelle. I believe it's the first time at Mekelle, and so I had submitted a paper to present there, and it got accepted, and so I went out there. But also right before that, the University of Hamburg, the Metzafbet, the Center for Ethiopian and Eritrean Manuscript Studies, did a kind of they do the summer school every year where they, kind of introduce people to kind of philology and history of Ethiopia and the study of Ethiopian and Eritrean manuscripts. And so I applied for that summer school, which was also in Mekelle right before the conference. It was in the conference was in October 1st through 5th, I believe it was, of 2018, and the summer school was the week before it. And so I applied for that, and I won that. I got accepted to that, and so they paid your airfare and your hotel and stuff like that out there for that. So I went and participated in that, but the summer school, it was right during the Mescal celebration or holiday, and they actually had a class the day of Mescal, and I 100% knew there was going to be nobody in the class, and nobody went to the class because it was Mescal, and so instead, the
exaltation of the True Cross, which is a big holiday in Ethiopia.
Yeah, exactly.
And in the Orthodox world in general, but Ethiopia.
Exactly. And so what I went with a couple of friends who are local to Mekelle, and we went to climb Choma, the mountain, where the gigantic mescal is on the side of the mountain, which is kind of the local tradition that everyone does there for the mescal holiday. And so when I climbed the mountain, I was just standing there, and they asked to interview me for Tigray TV. But then, as I found out, I also was just in random shots all over Tigray TV the whole time. I was sitting in our hotel one time, and someone was like, "Hey, you're on TV," and I looked up, and I was in the background at the conference and stuff like that. But it was a great experience. I have a lot of friends out there in Mekelle and in other parts of Tigray and stuff like that, and so I got to present my paper there, and it was a very nice time. It was a very lovely city, lovely place.
What was the subject matter again of the paper then?
The paper was on Fitha Negest too. It was on some evidence of the Fitha Negest and practical application in the early 16th century. Evidence that was taken from European travel narratives of Spanish and Portuguese that were first coming to the court of Lebna Dengel, and there's some evidence that I have in there of the Fitha Negest and practical application, and so I made that presentation there.
That must have been right after the victory over Garang Ahmed.
No, before.
Is it before? Is it before?
Yeah. It's the early 16th century.
Okay.
Yeah. This is before the jet. This is Alvarez's travel narrative Francisco Alvarez, who was I believe he is Spanish or Portuguese. I'm not sure. He's a Spanish or Portuguese Catholic um, uh, missionary, if you will, who was part of an embassy that went to Ethiopia in the early 16th century, just before Gran Muhammad's time.
I see. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. And we get a lot of people on this channel, Ethiopians and non-Ethiopians, who are general fans of history, which is why I'm glad to get a real historian here. I do the amateur hour stuff, but I get the real historian here to come on. What sort of general advice or parting thoughts would you have for people getting into Ethiopian history in terms of like what they get overwhelmed with? Is it such an epic span and range of history? Like where do you recommend they start? And what do they do about the whole language issue? You know, there are things written in Portuguese, in Italian, in French, in English, in Amharic, in Ge'ez, this, that, and the third.
Right. So if you're really, really digging into history, you're going to use all these different sources, right? You're going to use Italian sources. You're going to use, Portuguese sources. You're going to use English sources. You're going to use Amharic sources. You're going to use Ge'ez sources, Tigrinya, whatever you can find, right? And so, I mean, if you're really interested, you're not going to be overwhelmed, right? I think what you're going to,
Shots fired.
the biggest thing I'd really say is be wary.
For the monolingual American.
Monolingual American, I mean, church and state is always a good spot to start, right? I mean, this explains a lot of kind of the local, the dynamic between the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church and the kings, and also some of the surrounding kind of states within Ethiopia, Muslim states. It also discusses Judaism. It discusses other religions and stuff like that. It's a great text, I'd say, to start with. That's easy. That's an easy read too. It's not too difficult to follow. I'd say the biggest thing for anybody is you have to be careful about rabbit holes. Like if you really love Ethiopian history, you can discover something, reading something that you're really interested in, and then just go down a rabbit hole that's completely different than what you started out with. And I mean, at least for me, as a doctoral candidate who's writing my dissertation, that's what I have to be wary of: rabbit holes. There are always rabbit holes that serve to be kind of distractions that are distracting me from the main writing and the main issues. But sometimes they also turn up good material. So I'd say maybe choose your rabbit holes, put it that way.
That's right. And your talk of rabbit holes reminds me of something that could be general advice to people outside of the field of history, but who are in general trying to find academic niches or interests. And that's this balance between not trying to find something so narrow that there's not enough to say about it, not enough to research about it, but also not picking something so general that there's too much to say, or it's too many things, like you're not going to cover the ground. How do you strike that balance between the general and the narrow?
Well, I mean, so the general in many ways sometimes sets up the story for the narrow, right? So you kind of have to balance that out. Like, for example, when you're writing, you always have to give the background, the context. History is nothing without context, right? You got to give the context, right? So if I just started writing about Fitha Negest, people wouldn't know anything about the context of Ethiopia, of Aksumite, of or Bihera Gazi, you know what I'm saying? These different things, they without this context, they're not aware of the history, right? The grander history, or the general history, if you will. And then that sets up kind of the specialization, if you will, right? It's an introductory to the specialization, right? And so I think they kind of work hand in hand to a certain extent, right? The general kind of serves as your introduction and your conclusion, or your measuring stick, if you will, and the specific kind of deals with your main course, if you will, right? The meat of your research.
The kutfo with some wussa.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So kitfo or shakla tibs, whatever you want. You know what I'm saying? It's all good. Yeah, I would say they kind of work hand in hand. I don't think you can discount one or the other. I think in general, there's always a story to be told, whether you're dealing with specific kind of niche things in history, or if you're dealing with a grand general story. You know, if people are telling you this grand story of Axum to 1973 or something like that, you know what I'm saying? Then there's still value in that too, right? But I'd also say too that there's also a lot of history. So there's been a lot of people who are trying to decenter Ethiopian studies, right? Which I think
has on the periphery more.
Right, which I think has its value 100%. But also, I think you can also decenter the center, right? There's a lot of history that's been mistold, I feel like, within the center, right? That has helped effectively remove Ethiopia from Africa in the minds of Ethiopian studies or students of Ethiopia, right? They've removed it from the continent. It's kind of stands on its own. This is where you get all this rhetoric about, mixtures with Arabs and Arabs built the civilization and Semitic, you know what I'm saying? These whole kind of dynamics that are being discussed today, I think, are born in Ethiopian studies and born in these kind of misunderstandings and kind of characterizations of Ethiopian history or even the center of Ethiopian history. So I think it's not only Ethiopian studies needs to be decentered, I think also the center needs to be decentered. Like it's not, I think it's off, in general. So I think you need to read against the grain, so to speak, when doing history and when analyzing Ethiopian studies in the past, and especially when reading a lot of these older monographs and stuff like that from Italy, from Germany, from all these things. Like these were all written in time periods where people had very specific views of Africa and of Ethiopia and how Ethiopia fit into the larger African world or black world, if you will, or how they didn't fit in, if you will. And so I think that needs to be reapproached as well.
Yeah, wow. That goes back to what you were saying about the context and in general, how people need to see the context in which those writings occurred and what agendas, hidden and plain, are there in the text, and trying to not take what they say at face value, but digging deeper and deeper. I've seen this especially in social media lately, where people have been posting these videos of some of these foreign exchange students from Ethiopia in the early to mid 20th century. And they were spewing almost verbatim some of the material that you were saying without a critical lens. And for them, it was seen as muhurinat, as intellectualism, to be regurgitating those lies told about Ethiopia from some of these places that always had an agenda to break her up. And even now, we're seeing some media and some coordinated efforts to always attack and always trying to dismember this one uncolonized territory in the African continent.
Right.
And it's very saddening to see that continue. I don't know if you'd come across any of those foreign exchange.
Yeah, I've seen them, the old black and white ones where they're talking. Yeah, they're complete nonsense. And it's also, it's very interesting too, to look at those videos and to think about it too in the context of just how Africa has largely been viewed by the West and viewed, through different institutions, right? So most of these people are students who are being institutionalized, right? So they're regurgitating things that they probably learn in their institutions, right? And so you have to understand that too, that education is institutionalization, right? You're being institutionalized into different doctrines and the different ways of thinking and stuff like that. And so when you're looking at Ethiopia, I think you need to readjust the lens for sure, because Africa in itself is not a monolith, let alone Ethiopia, right? There's so much diversity in Ethiopia. It's mind-boggling, but then there's also many similarities between the different ethnic groups and between the different peoples and practices and stuff like that that shows kind of like long periods of contact, long periods of exchange, right? Intellectual exchange, to have these similarities in culture, to have these similarities in belief sets, to have these similarities in food and things like that, right? And so definitely Ethiopian studies needs to be reanalyzed in many ways. There's so much material out there, so much history that can be investigated, you know, and a lot of it needs to be done. I'm a firm advocate for Ethiopian historians, you know what I'm saying? From Ethiopia and also diaspora ones too, to really get involved in their history and to literally dig into their history and to look at their history beyond just reading texts and regurgitating kind of old narratives and stuff like that. There's a lot of material out there that can be found. There's a lot of oral history. There's a lot of proverbs. Like Ethiopian culture in general, every ethnicity has tons of proverbs that say so much about the culture and about the people and stuff like that, you know?
I gathered about 40 to 50 with my friend Johannes in one video, about 3 hours, and I've been trying to gather resources. I'm going to publish it probably as a $1 or $2 ebook, I've been thinking. And, you know, I'm hearkening in English.
Short, man. $5 ebook.
You know, I do it for the culture more than for the paper, but we want that paper too.
Yeah, but all labor deserves to be paid too, brother. But you know, but yeah, you should do that. I mean, there's so much valuable insight even from proverbs and from sayings and stuff like that, you know, that tell you a lot about the people, that can tell you.
Also one at you from what you were saying about how you made the appeals on your Fulbright. From not asking, people have lost the ability to be a duke or whatever the equivalent is in other English systems, like an aristocratic title.
Hey, and that's almost like a universal, right? If you don't ask, you never know, right? I mean, sometimes people don't know what they can get just by advocating for themselves, you know? So that's another thing too. Wherever you're going in your history too, if you're becoming a student of history and you're taking it to you know, an academic level, you know, master's degree, PhD, whatever it is, too, you also have to be your biggest advocate, right? You have to have confidence in yourself, right? Marcus Garvey said, without confidence, you're twice defeated in the race of life. With it, you've won before you even started. So that's always one of my favorite lines by him, you know? You always have to be cognizant of your own work and how it fits into things and be proud of what you're doing and you know? But at the same time, too, always be aware that there's tons of material out there. So, you know, kind of take everything, be balanced. That's the best way I can say it, I think.
መልካም መምህር ዳዊቴ እግዚአብሔር ይስጥልኝ አመሰግናለሁ።
እሺ እግዚአብሔር ይስጥልኝ ጎይታምኔ እንጉራግኛ and Dana Derwandam, you know, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.